Some women know the sound of love coming home at the end of the day. Eliza May knows the sound of her husband's boots means another beating is coming. Her husband Silas blames her for not giving him sons. Every day he gets angrier. Every day the beatings get worse. The neighbors hear everything but do nothing. Then, one cold night, a mountain man arrives at their door with twin baby boys. Their mother died giving birth. The mountain man's name is Bram, and he sees right through Silas. He sees a cruel man hurting a good woman. Bram stays to help on the ranch. The twin boys love Eliza, and she loves them back. Bram watches over her like family. He's patient and quiet, but when Silas finally goes too far, Bram shows him what real strength looks like. Will this broken woman finally find the family she's always wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado Territory stretched endlessly before the small homestead, a sea of brown grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Snow-capped mountains rose in the distance like ancient guardians, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. But inside the weathered cabin, Eliza May Dunn knew no such beauty existed in her world. She stood at the cracked window, her fingers tracing the thin pane of glass that separated her from freedom. The wedding ring on her finger had lost its shine years ago, the gold worn thin from nervous twisting during countless beatings. It hung loose now on her finger. She had grown thin, her body carrying the weight of sorrow rather than the children she'd once hoped to bear. 3 daughters, 3 tiny graves behind the cabin, Sarah, barely 2 months, Mary, who lived only 6 days, little Emma, who fought for 3 precious weeks before winter took her away. Each loss had hardened Silas's heart a little more, turned his disappointment into rage, his grief into violence. "Woman!" Silas's voice cracked like a whip from the main room. "This coffee ain't fit for hogs." Eliza's shoulders tensed involuntarily. She turned from the window and smoothed her faded dress, once blue, now the color of old storms. Her movements were practiced, careful, like a deer that had learned to move silently through predator territory. "I'll make fresh," she said softly, keeping her voice level. Arguing only made things worse. Silas Dunn sat hunched over the rough wooden table, his thick hands wrapped around a tin cup. At 42, he was still a powerful man, his shoulders broad from years of ranch work. But there was something rotten in him now, something that had curdled like milk left too long in the sun. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his eyes held the mean glint of a man who blamed the world for his disappointments. "Fresh ain't gonna fix what's wrong with you," he muttered, not looking up. "Can't even make decent coffee, can't give me sons. What good are you?" The familiar words stung, but Eliza had learned not to flinch visibly. She poured the coffee into the fire, the hiss of steam like her own suppressed cries, and began preparing a new pot. Her hands moved with automatic precision, while her mind drifted to safer places. She remembered her mother's kitchen back in Missouri, filled with the smell of fresh bread and her father's gentle laughter. That was before the fever took them both, before she was left alone at 18, with nothing but a desperate suitor promising security. Silas had seemed different, then quieter, but not cruel. The cruelty had come later, growing like a cancer with each lost child, each failed season, each day that passed without the sons he demanded. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards that Silas kept promising to fix but never did. The sound made Eliza think of bone-dry, brittle things that might snap at any moment. Like her own spirit, she sometimes feared. "Storm coming," Silas observed, finally looking up from his cup. His gaze swept over her with the same disdain he might show a lame horse. "Better hope it don't last long, got work to do." Work. Always work. The cattle that needed tending, the fence that needed mending, the endless chores that kept the ranch barely functioning. Silas worked hard, she had to give him that, but his efforts were born of desperation rather than pride. The ranch was failing slowly, like everything else in their lives. The nearest neighbor, the Hartwell family, lived 5 miles east, good people who kept to themselves and asked no uncomfortable questions. Betty Hartwell had kind eyes, but even she looked away when Eliza appeared in town with bruises. Such was a husband's right, folks said. The good book spoke of wives obeying their husbands, and who were they to interfere with God's plan? The afternoon wore on with its usual oppressive routine. Eliza tended to the chickens, while Silas worked on a section of fence that had blown down in the last storm. She could see him from the coop, his movements sharp with irritation as the wire fought his efforts to untangle it. Every snag, every frustration would be stored up like kindling, waiting for the match of evening's drink to set it ablaze. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eliza prepared their simple dinner: salt pork and beans, cornbread if they were lucky. The supplies were running low again, and she dreaded asking Silas about a trip to town. Money was always scarce, and his mood grew fouler with each expenditure. She was stirring the beans when she heard his hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Not the familiar rhythm of Silas's horse, but something different, steadier, more patient. "Silas," she called softly through the doorway. "Someone's coming." He looked up from his work, shading his eyes against the setting sun. A rider approached from the north, moving slowly despite the gathering darkness. As the figure drew closer, Eliza could make out a tall man on a sturdy mountain horse, something bundled carefully in his arms. "Help you?" Silas called out, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the fence post. The rider stopped a respectful distance away and dismounted with careful movements that spoke of injury or exhaustion. He was a big man, weathered by sun and wind, with hair the color of autumn leaves and a beard that had seen many seasons. His clothes were the practical garments of someone who lived rough leather and wool made for warmth and durability rather than appearance. "Name's Bram Tally," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Wonder if I might trouble you for shelter tonight. Got precious cargo here, needs to be out of the weather." It was then that Eliza saw what he carried: 2 small bundles wrapped in fur and cloth. Babies, twin boys, from the look of them, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep despite the cold evening air. "Babies don't pay for lodging," Silas said curtly. "This ain't no charity house." Bram's eyes grey as winter storms fixed on Silas with quiet assessment. "I can work for my keep. Good with stock, handy with repairs. These little ones just lost their mother. Birth took her 3 days back. I'm all they got now." There was something in his voice, a depth of pain that spoke of fresh grief, honestly carried. Eliza found herself stepping forward, despite her usual caution. "They're so small," she breathed, her maternal instincts stirring despite years of forced dormancy. "They must be cold, hungry." "They are," Bram acknowledged, his gaze shifting to her. In his eyes, she saw recognition not of who she was, but of what she carried. Pain recognized pain, survivor recognized survivor. "Been doing my best, but a man alone ain't equipped for this kind of need." Silas looked between his wife and the stranger, calculating. The man was obviously strong, and heaven knew there was work enough around the place. 2 more mouths to feed, but babies didn't eat much, and if the man could truly pull his weight— "One night," he decided grudgingly, "then we'll see about the rest." "Much obliged," Bram said simply. As he approached the cabin, Eliza noticed the careful way he moved, protecting the infants from every jostle. There was something noble in it, something that reminded her of how her own father had once carried her to bed after she'd fallen asleep by the fire. Inside the cabin, by the light of the oil lamp, she could see the babies more clearly. Identical boys, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, with dark hair and the kind of sturdy build that promised they would grow into strong men if they lived long enough. They were clean despite their circumstances, their clothes simple but well made. Someone had loved them, prepared for them. "Their mother?" Eliza asked quietly as she stirred up the fire. "Was she, did you know her well?" Something flickered across Bram's weathered features. "Well enough. She was a good woman, deserved better than dying alone in a trapper's cabin while the snow piled up outside." The babies began to stir, their small faces scrunching with approaching hunger. Eliza's hands moved without conscious thought, reaching for them with an instinct that had never quite died despite her losses. "May I?" she asked. Bram nodded and carefully transferred one of the boys to her arms. The weight of the child, solid, warm, alive and early, brought tears to her eyes. It had been so long since she'd held a living baby, felt the trust and need in that complete dependence. "What are their names?" she whispered. "Ain't got any yet," Bram admitted. "Their mama died before she could tell me what she'd chosen. Been calling them by colors. The one you're holding is blue on account of his eyes. The other's brown for his hair. Simple names, practical names. The kind a man alone might use when he had no woman's touch to soften the edges of life. But there was affection in the way he said them, protection in the way he watched her handle the child. "Blue," Eliza repeated softly, looking down into eyes that were indeed remarkable, clear and bright, despite his tender age. "Hello, little Blue." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a comment on his situation. His brother, still in Bram's arms, began to fuss in earnest. "They'll be wanting milk," Bram said. "I've got some goat's milk, but they prefer it warm." "I'll heat some," Eliza offered quickly. To Silas, who had been watching this domestic scene with growing irritation, she added, "We have that milk from the Hartwell cow. I could mix it proper for babies." "Waste of good milk," Silas grumbled, but he didn't forbid it. As she prepared bottles with the kind of care she'd once lavished on her own lost daughters, Eliza felt something stirring in her chest. Not hope she'd learned better than that, but something warmer than the cold emptiness she'd carried for so long. Behind her, she could hear Bram's low voice, talking quietly to Silas about the condition of the ranch, the prospects for spring planting, the price of cattle in Denver. Man talk, the kind that established worth and capability without boasting. But she noticed how his attention never strayed far from the babies, how his body remained alert despite his obvious exhaustion. This was a man who protected what was his. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the cabin's defenses. Storm weather for sure. But inside, for the first time in years, Eliza felt something approaching peace as she fed little Blue his bottle and watched his eyes drift closed in satisfaction. She didn't know then how this night would change everything. Didn't know that the mountain man with gentle hands and storm-grey eyes would become the catalyst for her own transformation. All she knew was that for this moment, holding a living child in her arms, while his father sat quietly grateful across the room, the world felt a little less broken. The storm could rage all it wanted outside. Something precious was taking shelter here, and Eliza May Dunn intended to guard it well. The storm raged through the night with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. Eliza lay awake in the narrow bed she shared with Silas, listening to the wind howl and the baby's occasional soft cries from the main room where Bram had made his bed on the floor. Each time one of the boys stirred, she heard the mountain man's gentle murmur, the creak of floorboards as he tended to them with patient care. Silas snored beside her, the whiskey on his breath sharp in the close air. He'd drunk more than usual after supper, his mood growing darker as he watched Eliza fuss over the babies. She'd seen that look before, the narrowing of his eyes, the tight set of his mouth. It meant trouble was coming. When dawn finally broke grey and sullen, the storm had passed, but left the world transformed. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, and ice glazed every surface with treacherous beauty. Eliza rose quietly, careful not to wake her husband, and padded barefoot to the main room. Bram sat in the old rocking chair, one baby cradled against his chest, while the other slept peacefully in a makeshift crib he'd fashioned from a wooden crate and her spare blankets. The sight of this big, weathered man caring so tenderly for the infants stirred something deep in her chest. "They sleep better with you than they did with me," she whispered, not wanting to wake Silas. "They know you got a gentle heart," Bram replied quietly. "Children sense these things. They feel safe with you." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had called her gentle? When had anyone noticed her heart at all? "Coffee?" she offered. "Much obliged." As she moved around the kitchen, Bram began to speak in low tones about the boy's mother. Her name had been Catherine, he told her. A minister's daughter from back east who'd come west with dreams of teaching school. Instead, she'd fallen in love with a fur trapper named Jack Morrisona. Good man, Bram said, but hard luck seemed to follow him like a shadow. Jack was my partner for nigh on 5 years, Bram explained, his voice carrying the weight of old friendship. We worked the high country together, shared camps and dangers. When he met Catherine, I seen him change. Soften, you might say. Love does that to a man if he lets it. Eliza poured the coffee with steady hands, though her heart was racing. Love. The word felt foreign, like something from another language she'd once known but forgotten how to speak. They were happy? She asked. Happy as two people can be living rough in the mountains. Catherine took to it better than you might expect. She could shoot straight, make a fire in wet weather, patch a man up when he got careless with his knife, but pregnancy, that was hard on her. The isolation, the worry. The baby in his arms, Brown, she reminded herself, stirred and opened dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with solemn attention. Bram adjusted his hold with practiced ease. Jack died in an avalanche this past winter, got caught trying to check his trap lines after a heavy snow. Catherine was near her time then, alone in that cabin, with nothing but her prayers and her stubbornness to see her through. You weren't with them? I'd gone down to Denver to sell our furs, get supplies for the rest of winter. By the time I got back, his voice caught slightly. Found Jack's body when the snow melted. Found Catherine 3 days later, still alive, but barely. She lived long enough to birth these boys, long enough to make me promise I'd see them raised proper. Eliza set the coffee cup beside him and settled into the other chair, her own cup warming her cold hands. That's a heavy promise to carry. Heavy promises are the only kind worth making, Bram said simply. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the boys sleep and listening to the cabin settle around them. Outside, she could hear Silas moving around, tending to the animals with his usual rough efficiency. Soon he'd be in for breakfast, and this peaceful moment would shatter like ice in spring. But for now, in this quiet space before the day truly began, Eliza allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to wake up every morning to gentle voices and baby sounds instead of curses and complaints. What it might be like to be valued for her tenderness rather than punished for her perceived failures. The door slammed open with enough force to rattle the windows. Silas stood in the doorway, snow still clinging to his coat, his face already dark with morning irritation. Storm brought down half the fence in the south pasture, he announced, stomping his boots on the threshold. Gonna take all day to fix, and that's if the ground ain't froze too hard to set new posts. I can help with that, Bram offered, carefully rising from the chair with Brown still in his arms. I've done my share of fence work. Silas's eyes swept the domestic scene, his wife in her nightdress, the mountain man holding a baby, the second child sleeping peacefully nearby. Something ugly flickered across his features. I'll bet you have, he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Eliza's stomach clench with familiar dread. Seems you're real comfortable making yourself at home here. Just grateful for the shelter, Bram replied evenly, but Eliza caught the subtle way his posture shifted, ready for trouble without appearing threatening. Grateful. Silas spat the word like it tasted bitter. Well, gratitude don't fix fences or pay for the food you're eating. You want to stay on, you'll earn your keep proper. That's fair. Is it? Silas moved closer, and Eliza could smell the anger on him, sharp as the whiskey from the night before. Seems to me a man with 2 babies to feed ought to be worried about finding permanent work, not playing house with another man's wife. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Eliza felt her face flush hot with shame and fear. She started to rise, to explain, to somehow diffuse the situation before it exploded. Silas, we were just... Shut your mouth, woman. His hand moved fast, catching her across the cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound cracked through the cabin like a whip. Eliza stumbled backward, her hand flying to her stinging face. It wasn't the hardest blow she'd ever taken, but something about it, the casual cruelty in front of a witness, the way it shattered the morning's peace cut, deeper than usual. "Sir." Bram's voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made even Silas pause. "That's not necessary." "What ain't necessary is you telling me how to handle my own wife in my own house." Silas took a step toward Bram, his fists clenching. "You got something to say about it?" The baby in Bram's arms began to fuss, sensing the tension. Bram's attention shifted to soothing the child, his big hands gentle as he swayed slightly back and forth. But his eyes stayed fixed on Silas, with the cold steadiness of a man taking measure. "I got nothing to say about your business," Bram replied carefully. "Just seems like there's work to be done, and babies need tending. Might be better if we all focused on that." It was the right thing to say, diplomatic, non-threatening, but Eliza could see it wasn't enough. Silas was working himself up to something, the way he always did when he felt his authority challenged. She knew the signs, the way his shoulders bunched, the flush creeping up his neck, the dangerous glitter in his eyes. "The babies need tending," Silas mimicked in a mocking voice. "That's women's work. But I suppose a man who can't provide proper for his own blood might not understand the difference." The insult was calculated and cruel. Bram's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but when he spoke, his voice remained level. "These boys aren't my blood," he said quietly. "But they're my responsibility now. I intend to see them raised right, with kindness and care. That's what their mama would have wanted. Their mama's dead. Dead people don't want nothing." Silas stepped closer still, close enough that Bram would have to back down or stand his ground. "What I want is to know exactly what you're after, coming here with your sob story and your pretty words. I'm after shelter from the storm and honest work to pay for it. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then you won't mind working hard for your keep, real hard, and keeping your eyes and your opinions to yourself. That's agreeable." But Eliza could see it wasn't agreeable at all. Something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, something that couldn't be taken back. Silas had shown his true nature in front of a witness, and Bram, patient, gentle Bram, had seen it all. As the two men stared at each other across the small space, she realized with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that everything was about to change. The storm had brought more than snow and wind to their door. It had brought a reckoning that had been years in the making. The twins began to cry in earnest now, their small voices rising in harmony. And somewhere in that sound, Eliza heard an echo of her own long-silenced sobs, the grief of children who deserved better, women who deserved protection, men who deserved to be more than the violence that had shaped them. The inciting incident was complete. The careful balance of her trapped life had been disturbed, and now there could be no going back to the way things were. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine, like dancers learning steps to music that might stop at any moment. Bram worked alongside Silas with quiet efficiency, his presence transforming the ranch's daily operations in ways that were impossible to ignore. Fences that had sagged for months were tightened and reinforced. The barn door that had hung crooked since the last winter finally swung true. Even the ornery milk cow seemed calmer under his steady hand. But it was the small things that revealed the measure of the man. The way he carved new handles for tools worn smooth by Silas's grip. How he reinforced the chicken coop against predators that had been picking off hens for weeks. The careful attention he paid to every task, no matter how humble, spoke of someone who understood that details mattered, that caring for things properly was a form of respect. Eliza watched him work from the cabin windows, her hands busy with mending, while the twins napped in their improvised cradles. Blue had taken to sleeping, with his tiny fist curled around her finger, as if anchoring himself to her presence. Brown was more restless, often fussing, until she sang the old hymns her mother had taught her. Their different temperaments were already emerging, and she found herself learning their individual rhythms, the way she'd once learned to read weather patterns in the sky. "Woman," Silas's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. "These beans are burnt again. Can't you do anything right?" She turned from the window, her stomach tightening with familiar dread. Silas stood over the pot, his face twisted with disgust as he stirred the contents with unnecessary violence. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, moving toward the stove. "I was watching the babies and—" "The babies ain't your concern. Them boys got a father to tend them." He gestured toward the window where Bram could be seen working on the fence. "Your concern is keeping this house proper and your husband fed." The unfairness of it stung. She'd been caring for the twins because Bram was doing the work Silas demanded of him. But explaining that would only make things worse. Instead, she began scraping the burnt beans from the bottom of the pot, salvaging what she could. "Maybe next time you'll pay attention to what matters," Silas continued, his voice growing darker. "Instead of mooning over other folks' business." His hand struck the back of her head, not hard enough to knock her down, but sharp enough to make her vision blur for a moment. The casual nature of it was almost worse than the pain. He hit her the way another man might swat a fly, with absent irritation rather than passion. From their makeshift cradles, both babies began to cry. The sound seemed to pierce through Silas's anger, reminding him they had an audience, even when Bram wasn't present. He looked toward the twins with undisguised resentment. "Shut them up," he ordered. "Man can't think with all that caterwauling." Eliza hurried to comfort the babies, lifting Blue first because his cries were more urgent. As she held him against her shoulder, patting his small back in soothing circles, she noticed Bram had appeared in the doorway. He stood there, silent and still, his weathered face unreadable as he took in the scene. "Fence is done," he reported to Silas, his voice carefully neutral. "Strong enough to hold through whatever weather comes." "Better be." Silas barely glanced up from his bowl. "Cat'll get out again. It'll come out of whatever wages I might owe you." Bram nodded once, then moved to wash his hands in the basin by the door. His movements were economical, practiced, but Eliza noticed how his eyes kept returning to her and the babies. There was a quality to his attention that she'd almost forgotten, existed protective without being possessive, concerned without being demanding. "Might be good to check the water troughs before the next freeze," Bram suggested as he dried his hands. "Ice could crack the wood if it's not tended proper." "I know how to manage my own stock," Silas replied curtly. But Eliza could see him considering the advice, despite his defensive tone. The ranch had been running better since Bram's arrival, and even Silas's pride couldn't blind him to that fact entirely. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself stealing glances at the mountain man as he went about his work. There was something mesmerizing about his competence, the way he handled tools with sure hands, the patience he showed with bulky livestock, the quiet authority that made even the most stubborn animals settle under his touch. She remembered her father being like that, calm in crisis, steady in purpose, gentle in strength. Silas had seemed that way once too, in the early days of their courtship. But Silas's steadiness had proven shallow, eroded by disappointment and drink, until only the hardness remained. Bram was different. His calm ran deeper, like a well that had been dug down to bedrock. Whatever storms had shaped him, the loss of his partner, the responsibility of the orphaned twins, the hard years in the mountains had forged rather than broken him. That evening, as she prepared supper, she found herself humming softly to keep the babies content. Brown had developed a preference for being held while she cooked, his dark eyes following her movements with solemn attention. She'd fashioned a sling from an old shawl that let her carry him against her chest while keeping her hands free for kitchen work. "You're getting attached to them, boys," Silas observed from his chair by the fire. His tone was deceptively casual, but she knew him well enough to hear the warning underneath. "They need tending," she replied carefully. "Babies can't care for themselves. They got a father for that. He's working, doing the jobs you set him." "Don't sass me, woman." Silas's voice hardened. "I see how you look at them, how you look at him, like you're playing at happy families with another man's leavings." The accusation hit like a physical blow. She turned from the stove, her face burning with shame and indignation. "I'm just trying to help. They're innocent babies who lost their mother. And you lost 3 of your own that don't give you the right to steal other folks' children." The words were calculated to wound. and they found their mark. Her arms tightened involuntarily around Brown, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. The memory of her own lost daughters rose like ghosts, their small faces pale and still in death. "I'm not stealing anything," she whispered. "No? Then why you singing to them like they was yours? Why you fussing over them like you're their mama, instead of just some woman providing temporary care?" Because it felt like coming alive again after years of numbness, because their small warm bodies against hers reminded her that she was capable of nurturing, of protection, of love. Because when Brown curled his tiny fingers around hers, or Blue smiled in his sleep after feeding, she remembered who she used to be before, grief and violence carved out her insides. But she couldn't say any of that, couldn't explain how the babies had awakened parts of herself she'd thought were buried with her daughters. Instead, she turned back to the stove and continued cooking, letting her silence speak for itself. Outside, she could hear Bram's voice talking softly to the animals as he secured them for the night. There was a ritual quality to it, a gentleness that spoke of someone who understood that all creature human and animal alike needed kindness to thrive. As she set the table for supper, she found herself wondering what it would be like to live in a house where such gentleness was the rule rather than the exception, where babies could grow up hearing lullabies instead of curses, seeing care instead of cruelty. The thought was dangerous, she knew. Hope had always been her enemy in this place. But as she looked down at Brown's trusting face and heard Blue stirring peacefully in his cradle, she felt something stirring in her chest that was stronger than caution. For the first time in years, Eliza May Dunn began to believe that a different kind of life might be possible. Winter tightened its grip on the Colorado Territory with the persistence of a creditor collecting debts. Each morning brought fresh challenges, frozen water troughs, livestock huddled against the bitter wind, and supplies running dangerously low. But within the confines of the small cabin, something unexpected was blooming despite the harsh season. Eliza had begun keeping a journal, scratching her thoughts onto pages torn from an old ledger with a pencil worn down to little more than a stub. She wrote by lamplight after the men had gone to sleep, recording not the daily brutalities she'd grown accustomed to, but the small moments of grace that Bram and the babies had brought into her life. "Blue smiled today when I sang to him," she wrote one evening. "A real smile, not just gas like Silas claims. His whole face lit up like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Made my heart feel too big for my chest. Brown is getting stronger, tries to hold his head up when I carry him around the cabin. Bram says he's got the look of a fighter about him. I think he means it kindly, but I hope these boys never have to fight for anything. Hope they grow up knowing they're wanted and loved." The journal itself was her secret rebellion, hidden beneath loose floorboards under their bed. In its pages, she could speak truths that would earn her beatings if voiced aloud. She could admit that she looked forward to Bram's quiet presence at breakfast, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words carried weight. She could confess that holding the babies felt like reclaiming a part of herself she'd thought lost forever. 3 weeks after Bram's arrival, the twins achieved a milestone that changed everything. Blue, lying on a blanket near the fire while Eliza folded laundry, looked directly at her and made a sound that wasn't quite a cry or a coo, but something in between, purposeful, seeking. "Mama," he babbled, his tiny mouth working around the syllables. "Ma-ma-ma." The breath left her lungs in a rush. She knelt beside him, tears gathering in her eyes as he repeated the sound, his blue eyes fixed on her face with unmistakable recognition. "Bram," she called softly, not wanting to startle the baby, but needing someone to witness this miracle. "Bram, come quick." He appeared in the doorway, alerted by the wonder in her voice. "What is it?" "Listen." She leaned over Blue, encouraging him with gentle sounds. "Say it again, sweet boy. Tell him what you said." Blue gurgled happily and obliged. "Mama, mama, mama." The effect on Bram was immediate and profound. His weathered face softened with something approaching reverence as he knelt beside them, watching Blue's chubby arms wave with excitement at his own cleverness. "Well, I'll be," Bram murmured, Little man knows who takes care of him. It's just baby talk, Eliza said quickly, though her heart was soaring. They don't mean anything by it yet, don't they? Bram's grey eyes met hers with gentle understanding. Seems to me babies know more than we give them credit for. They know who feeds them, who comforts them when they cry, who loves them. The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither dared explore fully. Love. Such a simple word for such a complex reality. But there it was, spoken aloud at last. From his own blanket, Brown made an imperious sound that clearly demanded equal attention. Eliza scooped him up, and he immediately began his own version of the game. "Pa, pa," he announced with satisfaction, looking directly at Bram. "Pa, pa, pa." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Bram went very still, his throat working as he processed what he'd heard. These weren't his children by blood, but they'd claimed him just as surely as if genetics had bound them together. "Pa, pa," Brown repeated, reaching tiny hands toward the man who'd carried him through a blizzard and tended him through countless nights. "Hello there, son," Bram whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears as he carefully took the baby. "Hello, little Brown." It was in that moment, watching this gentle giant hold a child who'd chosen him as father, seeing the fierce protectiveness that transformed his features, that Eliza realized she was falling in love. Not the desperate, clutching need she'd mistaken for love with Silas, but something deeper and more dangerous, something that made her want to be brave. The sound of boots on the porch shattered the tender moment. Silas pushed through the door, bringing cold air and the sharp smell of whiskey with him. His eyes swept the domestic scene, taking in Eliza's tear-bright face, Bram's protective posture with Brown, Blue still reaching toward his chosen mama from the blanket. "What's all this?" he demanded, his voice already sharp with suspicion. "The boys are starting to talk," Eliza said, trying to keep her tone light. Blue said mama clear as day. "Baby talk don't mean nothing," Silas dismissed, but his eyes were dark with something uglier than mere irritation. "Animals make noise too. Don't mean they're speaking." "They're not animals," she replied before she could stop herself. "They're babies learning to communicate with the people who care for them." The defiance in her voice was small but unmistakable. Silas heard it, and his face flushed with the particular anger reserved for challenges to his authority. "The people who care for them?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous low tone she knew too well. "And who might that be exactly?" "I just meant—" "I know what you meant." His hand shot out, gripping her chin with fingers that would leave bruises. "You meant you're playing mama to another man's bastards, while your own husband goes without proper attention." "Silas, please." "Please what? Please keep letting you make a fool of me in my own house." His grip tightened, forcing her to look into eyes gone cold with rage. "Please pretend I don't see you mooning over that mountain man like some lovesick schoolgirl." From the corner of her eye, she saw Bram rise to his feet, still holding Brown, but every line of his body taut with barely controlled tension. "Let her go," Bram said quietly. The words fell into the charged atmosphere like a match into kindling. Silas's head snapped toward him, his grip on Eliza's chin loosening slightly. "What did you say to me?" "I said, let her go." Bram's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath now. "You're hurting her." "She's my wife. I'll handle her however I see fit." "No," Bram replied simply. "You won't." The confrontation crystallized everything that had been building since that first morning. Two very different kinds of men facing each other across a divide that couldn't be bridged with words. Silas, who ruled through fear and violence. Bram, who protected through strength and conviction. Silas released Eliza so abruptly she stumbled backward, but his attention was fixed entirely on Bram now. "You threatening me in my own house? I'm telling you that hurting women and children stops here. Today. Now." "Is that so?" Silas's laugh was ugly. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it, Mountain Man? You got no claim here, no rights, no say in how I run my business." "Maybe not," Bram acknowledged. "But I got eyes to see and hands to act. That's enough." The two babies, sensing the tension, began to fuss. Their cries seemed to emphasize the stakes innocent lives hanging in the balance, while grown men decided what kind of world they would inherit. Eliza watched her husband's face cycle through rage, calculation, and something approaching fear. For the first time in their marriage, he was facing an opponent who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who wouldn't be bullied or broken. "This ain't over," Silas said finally, his voice thick with promise. "No," Bram agreed quietly. "I don't expect it is." But something had shifted irrevocably. The lines were drawn now, the choices made clear. And for the first time since her wedding day, Eliza May Dunn began to believe that someone was willing to fight for her. Spring arrived in the Colorado Territory like a timid visitor, showing herself in small gestures before committing to stay. Patches of green pushed through the lingering snow, and the mountain peaks began to shed their white mantles under the strengthening sun. The harsh winter that had driven Bram to their door was finally releasing its grip, but the tensions within the cabin seemed to intensify with each warming day. The ranch flourished under Bram's steady influence. Calves that had struggled through the bitter months now thrived in the sweet grass of the meadows. Fences stood straight and strong. The vegetable garden that Eliza had given up on years ago showed promise once again, neat rows of green shoots marking where Bram had helped her plant beans, corn, and squash. But prosperity bred its own dangers. Each improvement was another reminder to Silas that another man was succeeding where he had failed. Each grateful look from Eliza toward their quiet guest was fuel for the rage that simmered constantly now, just below the surface. The babies had grown sturdy and bright during the winter months. Blue had developed Eliza's gentleness, reaching for flowers with careful fingers and babbling contentedly as she carried him around her daily tasks. Brown was more adventurous, already trying to pull himself upright in his crib and showing signs of the stubborn determination that would serve him well in the hard country they called home. Both boys had claimed their chosen parents completely. Mama and Papa were their most frequent words, delivered with the absolute confidence of children who knew themselves loved and protected. The names fell easily from their lips, but each utterance was like a dagger to Silas's pride. On a particularly warm morning in early April, Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Two men on horseback crested the small hill to the east, their pace deliberate but unhurried. She shaded her eyes against the sun and recognized the larger figure immediately, Sheriff Tom Bradley from town, his silver star glinting on his vest. The second man was a stranger, thin and sharp-faced, with the calculating eyes of someone who made his living from other people's troubles. He carried himself with the particular arrogance of those who mistake cruelty for strength. "Eliza," Silas called from the barn. "Get inside now." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through her despite the warm air. She quickly gathered the twins, who had been playing on a blanket in the shade, and hurried toward the cabin. Through the window, she watched Silas emerge to greet the riders, his shoulders tense with the kind of alertness that meant danger. Bram appeared from the field where he'd been working, walking with the deceptively casual gait of a man ready for trouble. He'd stripped to his shirt sleeves in the heat, and Eliza could see the powerful muscles of his arms and shoulders moving under the worn fabric. There was something different about his bearing, now coiled, watchful, like a wolf that had scented hunters on the wind. "Sheriff Bradley," Silas called out with false heartiness. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Official business, Silas." Bradley's voice carried the weight of authority, but there was something apologetic in his tone. He was a good man, Eliza knew, caught between duty and conscience more often than he preferred. "Here's Agent Morrison from the Territorial Marshal's office. Got some questions, needs asking." Morrison. The name hit Eliza like a physical blow, the same surname as the twins' father, the fur trapper who had died in the avalanche. Coincidence seemed unlikely in a territory where names carried weight and family connections ran deep. "Questions about what?" Silas demanded, but his bravado was paper-thin. "About a man named Bram Talley." Morrison replied, his cold eyes scanning the ranch until they fixed on Bram's approaching figure. Wanted in connection with several deaths up in the high country. That so? Silas's voice held a note of satisfaction that made Eliza's stomach turn. Well, Agent Morrison, you're in luck. That's him right there. Bram stopped about 10 feet from the group, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready. His grey eyes moved between the two officials, reading their intentions with the skill of a man who had survived by understanding danger. I'm Bram Tally, he said simply. What's your business with me? Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. My business is justice, Mr. Tally. Justice for my brother Jack and the others you murdered in cold blood. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Eliza pressed her hand to her mouth, understanding flooding through her as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Jack Morrison twins' father. This hard-faced man was their uncle, and he believed Bram had killed his brother. Jack Morrison died in an avalanche, Bram said calmly. I found his body myself when the snow cleared. Buried him proper. Said words over his grave. Convenient story, Morrison sneered. Real convenient that you were the only witness, just like you were the only witness when those other trappers died under mysterious circumstances. Funny how often death follows you around, Tally. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Agent Morrison, I should point out that Mr. Tally hasn't been formally charged with... He's charged now, Morrison cut him off, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Murder warrant, signed by the territorial judge. Bram Tally, you're under arrest. The words fell like hammer blows. Eliza felt her world tilting, everything she'd begun to hope for crashing down around her. Behind the men, she could see Silas's face, ugly with triumph. He'd known this was coming, had probably sent word to town himself, trading Bram's freedom for whatever twisted satisfaction it gave him to destroy what she'd found. This is about the babies, isn't it? She found herself saying, stepping onto the porch despite Silas's earlier order to stay inside. You want the boys? Morrison's attention snapped to her, and she saw acknowledgement in his cold eyes. Those children are Morrison blood. They belong with family, not with the man who murdered their father. I didn't murder anyone, Bram said, his voice still steady but carrying an edge now. Jack died in a slide on Devil's Ridge. Catherine died in childbirth 3 days after I found his body. I gave my word to see their boys raised proper, and that's what I'm doing. Your word? Morrison laughed harshly. The word of a killer? Those boys are coming with me, back to proper Christian folk who'll raise them right. No. The word came from Eliza before she could stop it. No, they're not. Every eye turned to her. She stood on the porch, trembling but resolute, the twins in her arms looking up at her with the trust that had become her anchor in this storm. They're just babies, she continued, her voice growing stronger. They don't know you. They know us. This is their home. Woman, shut your mouth, Silas snarled. This ain't your affair. But Morrison was studying her with new interest. You're attached to them, he observed. That's natural enough, I suppose. But they're Morrison boys, and they'll be raised as such. By you? Eliza asked, seeing the coldness in his face, the casual cruelty that reminded her too much of her husband. A man who'd tear babies from the only family they've ever known. By my sister in Denver, Morrison corrected. A good woman with a proper husband and the means to provide for them. And if they don't want to go, if they cry for their mama and papa, they're babies. They'll forget. The casual dismissal of the bonds that had been forged through months of care and love struck her like a slap. She thought of Blue's first smile, of Brown's determined efforts to walk, of the way they both settled when she sang to them. The idea that such love could be dismissed as temporary, replaceable, filled her with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. No, she said again, more firmly this time. They won't forget, and I won't let you take them. Morrison's face hardened. Mrs. Dunn, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but those boys are coming with me whether you like it or not. The law is on my side. The law, Bram said quietly, should be about protecting children, not tearing them from the people who love them. You'll have plenty of time to philosophize about law from inside a jail cell, Morrison replied. He gestured to Sheriff Bradley. Arrest him. Bradley hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Maybe we could talk this through a bit more." "Now, Sheriff." With obvious reluctance, Bradley dismounted and approached Bram, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I'm sorry, Bram. I've got no choice here." "I understand, Tom." Bram's voice was resigned but not defeated. "You're just doing your job." As the sheriff moved to bind Bram's hands, Eliza felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart that would come later. Something deeper and more fundamental. The last chain that had held her to the life of quiet desperation she'd accepted as her fate. These men, Morrison, with his cold ambition, Silas, with his petty cruelties, even good-hearted Sheriff Bradley, with his willingness to follow unjust orders, they all saw her as powerless. A woman whose opinions didn't matter, whose love could be dismissed, whose choices were irrelevant. They were about to learn how dangerous it was to underestimate a mother protecting her children. The summer heat settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, intensifying everything it touched. Tempers that had simmered through spring now threatened to boil over with each passing day. The confrontation with Agent Morrison had changed the fundamental dynamics of their small world, leaving everyone walking on ground that felt increasingly unstable. Bram had managed to avoid immediate arrest through Sheriff Bradley's reluctant intervention. The lawman had pointed out that formal extradition procedures would take time, and Morrison had been forced to retreat to town to file the proper paperwork. But the reprieve felt temporary, like the calm before a particularly violent storm. In the weeks that followed, Bram began teaching Eliza things that had nothing to do with ranch work. How to move silently across creaking floorboards, where to hide if trouble came calling, how to hold a knife so it couldn't be taken from her easily. The lessons were subtle, woven into their daily routines, but their purpose was unmistakable. "You're planning to run," she said one evening, as they worked together to repair a section of the chicken coop. The twins played nearby in the shade, Blue carefully stacking wooden blocks, while Brown attempted to eat everything within reach. "I'm planning for possibilities," Bram replied carefully, his hands steady on the wire he was weaving through the wooden frame. "Morrison won't give up. Men like him don't know how." "Men like him?" Bram paused in his work, his grey eyes distant with memory. "The kind who mistake persistence for righteousness, who think being related to someone gives them the right to tear apart that person's family." Eliza understood. She'd lived with such a man for 7 years, though Silas's cruelties were smaller in scale, if not in impact. The principle was the same, the belief that power justified any action, no matter how it hurt the innocent. "What about the boys?" she asked quietly. "What about them? If you run, Morrison will just take them. He'll say you abandoned them, that they need proper family." Bram's hands stilled completely. When he looked at her, she saw the pain he usually kept so carefully hidden. "I won't abandon them, Eliza. But I won't let them watch me hang for crimes I didn't commit either. Sometimes the best way to protect people is to remove the danger they're attached to." "And sometimes," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness, "the best way to protect people is to stand and fight." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the choice that was coming, whether they wanted it or not. That evening, as she put the twins to bed in their makeshift cribs, both boys reached for her with the easy trust of children who had never known abandonment. Blue babbled his version of a lullaby, while Brown clutched the small wooden horse that Bram had carved for them to share. The toy was simple but perfect, each detail smoothed by patient hands until it felt like silk under small fingers. "Horse," Blue said clearly, holding up the toy with obvious pride in his expanding vocabulary. "Papa horse." The words hit her like a physical blow. Papa. Not the man who had sired them, but the one who had carried them through blizzards, tended them through illness, taught them that the world could be gentle if you knew where to look. "Yes," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Papa made it for you." From the main room, she could hear Silas and Bram discussing the next day's work. Their voices were civil, even cordial, but she'd learned to hear the undercurrents. Silas's resentment had grown more sophisticated over the months, less likely to explode into violence, but more dangerous for being controlled. He was planning something. She could see it in the way he watched Bram work, the calculating gleam in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The arrest warrant had given him leverage, and men like Silas always used whatever weapons came to hand. Later, after the men had settled into their respective sleeping areas, she found herself unable to rest. The cabin felt too small, too confining, like a trap waiting to spring. She slipped from her bed, careful not to wake her snoring husband, and padded barefoot to the window. The moon was nearly full, painting the ranch in silver light. Everything looked peaceful, the sleeping cattle, the neat garden rows, the sturdy fences that spoke of Bram's careful attention. But she knew how deceptive appearances could be. Her own marriage had looked proper enough from the outside. A movement near the barn caught her attention. Bram stood in the shadows, his tall figure unmistakable, even in the dim light. He wasn't doing anything particular, just standing, watching, thinking. But there was something in his posture that spoke of a man saying goodbye. Without conscious decision, she found herself moving toward the door. The floorboards that usually creaked under her weight remained silent. She'd learned Bram's lessons well. The night air was warm on her face as she stepped onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the weathered wood. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned at her voice, unsurprised by her presence. Too much to think about. She joined him in the shadows, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but careful to maintain a proper distance. Even now, with everything falling apart around them, she was mindful of appearances. Habits of caution died hard. "The twins asked for you today when you were in the far pasture," she said. "Brown kept pointing toward where you'd gone and saying, 'Papa.' Blue cried when I couldn't make you appear." Bram's breath caught slightly. "They're young. They'll adapt." "Will they?" She turned to face him fully, studying his profile in the moonlight. "Or will they spend their lives wondering why the people they loved just disappeared one day?" "Eliza, I know what it's like," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "to be left by someone who was supposed to protect you. My parents didn't choose to leave, but the result was the same. That emptiness doesn't go away, it just changes shape." They stood in silence for a long moment, the night sounds of the ranch filling the space between them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound was answered by another, then another. Even wild things understood the importance of family. "What would you have me do?" Bram asked finally. "Morrison has the law on his side. Silas has made it clear I'm not welcome here permanently. The twins deserve better than watching the man they called Papa led away in chains." "The twins deserve better than losing another father," she replied, "and I deserve better than losing the only man who's ever treated me like I matter." The words hung between them, dangerous and true. She'd said too much, revealed too much, but she found she didn't care. Some truths were worth the risk. "Eliza," his voice was rough with emotion, "you don't know what you're saying." "Don't I?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. "I'm saying that I love those boys like they were born from my body. I'm saying that you've shown me what it means to feel safe in my own home. I'm saying that if you run, you'll be taking my heart with you. Your husband is a man who beats women and calls it marriage, who would hand over innocent children to strangers for spite, who sees love as weakness and kindness as stupidity." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "You're not my husband, Bram, but you're the man I wish I'd married." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Bram reached out slowly, his calloused hand cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness. "You deserve so much more than what you've been given," he said quietly. "Then help me take it," she whispered back. In the distance, thunder rumbled a summer storm approaching from the mountains. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not. The only question was whether they would face it together or apart. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses approaching broke the intimate moment. 3 riders this time, moving fast through the night. Eliza's heart clenched with sudden fear as she recognized the purposeful pace of men on official business. Morrison had returned, and he hadn't come alone. The riders came with the thunder, their torches casting dancing shadows across the ranch as they approached the cabin. Morrison led them, flanked by two deputy marshals whose badges gleamed in the flickering light. But it was the fourth man who made Eliza's blood turn to ice in her veins, a weathered trapper she'd never seen before, his eyes wild with the particular madness of someone who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness. "Tally," Morrison's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Come out with your hands where we can see them." Bram stepped protectively in front of Eliza, his body tense with controlled energy. From inside the cabin came the sound of stirring Silas waking to the commotion, the babies beginning to cry at the harsh voices. "What do you want, Morrison?" Bram called back, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "What I've always wanted, Justice." Morrison dismounted, his men following suit. "But tonight, I've got something better than warrants and legal papers. Tonight, I've got a witness." He gestured to the wild-eyed trapper, who stepped forward with the jerky movements of a man unused to civilization. When he spoke, his voice was harsh from years of shouting over mountain winds. "Name's Pike Jennings," the trapper announced, "and I seen what this man done to Jack Morrison and them other boys. Seen it with my own eyes." Eliza felt Bram go rigid beside her. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the sudden tension that radiated from his body, the way his breathing changed. This wasn't the righteous calm of an innocent man facing false accusations. This was something else entirely. "That's impossible," Bram said quietly. "There were no witnesses to Jack's death. The avalanche weren't no avalanche that killed Jack Morrison." Jennings interrupted, spitting into the dirt. "Was 3 bullets from your rifle, Tally, same as the others, same as you've been doing for years up in the high country." "That's a lie." But even as Bram spoke the words, Eliza heard something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not quite doubt, but recognition. As if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in ways he didn't like. Morrison smiled, the expression cold as winter starlight. "Tell them about the cash, Pike. Tell them what you found." Jennings reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age and stained with what looked like old blood. "Found this nailed to a tree near Devil's Ridge, about a month after Jack died. Hidden real good, but not good enough." He handed the paper to Morrison, who unfolded it with ceremonial care. In the torchlight, Eliza could see it was some kind of official document, covered in dense text and official seals. "A wanted poster," Morrison announced with satisfaction. "For one Bartholomew Tally, former Deputy Marshal of the Colorado Territory. Wanted for the murders of 3 fellow lawmen and the theft of territorial gold. Reward, $5,000, dead or alive." The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza felt the world shift beneath her feet as the implications crashed over her like a rockslide. Bartholomew Tally. Bram was short for Bartholomew. The gentle giant who carved toys for children and sang lullabies in the darkness was a wanted killer. "That's not," she started to say, but Bram's voice cut across hers. "The poster's real," he said quietly, his words falling like stones into still water. "But the story behind it isn't what you think." "Ain't what I think," Morrison's voice rose with righteous fury. "You murdered my brother and God knows how many others, and you got the gall to stand there making excuses." "I didn't murder your brother," Bram replied, his voice carrying a weight of truth that cut through the accusations. "But I did kill those 3 deputies, had to save my own life and the lives of innocent people." The admission hit Eliza like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand reaching for the porch rail for support. The man she'd fallen in love with, the gentle protector who'd shown her what kindness looked like, he was a killer after all. "Bram," she whispered, the word carrying all her confusion and betrayal. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw pain that went deeper than any physical wound. "I should have told you," he said softly. "Should have explained from the beginning. But I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now." "Tell us now," one of the deputy marshals demanded, his hand resting on his gun. "Tell us about the gold, about the murders." Bram was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Eliza to the cabin where she could hear Silas comforting the crying babies. The irony wasn't lost on her abusive husband, tending the children, while their chosen father stood accused of murder. "I was a deputy marshal for 6 years, Bram began, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "Good at my job, believed in the law, had a wife named Sarah, a baby on the way. We lived in a little house in Leadville, and I thought I was building something worthwhile." Morrison started to interrupt, but Bram held up a hand. "The territorial gold shipments were my responsibility. Every month, I'd escort them from the mines to the bank in Denver. Same route, same schedule. Should have known someone would figure out how to turn that routine against me." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. 3 deputies came to my house one night, said they had orders to arrest me for theft, conspiracy, murder. But they didn't have warrants, didn't have evidence. What they had was a plan to steal that month's shipment and pin it on me. "Lies," Morrison snarled. "You're nothing but a killer trying to justify." "They shot my wife first," Bram continued, his voice deadly quiet now. "Sarah was 8 months pregnant, and they put 2 bullets in her just to watch me break. Then they told me how it was going to work, how I was going to help them steal the gold, then take the blame when they discovered my crimes." Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. The pain in his voice was too real to be fabricated, too deep to be anything but truth lived and survived. "I killed all 3 of them," Bram said simply, "shot them down like the rabid dogs they were. But it was too late for Sarah, too late for our baby, too late for the life I'd built." "So, you became an outlaw," Morrison accused. "Killed my brother for his gold, killed others." "I became a ghost," Bram corrected. "Took to the mountains to die. Figured it was what I deserved. But dying's harder than it looks when you're too stubborn to quit breathing. So I learned to trap, learned to survive, learned to stay away from people so I couldn't hurt anyone else." "Then why'd you come here?" Eliza found her voice at last, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "Why bring the boys here if you're so dangerous?" Bram's eyes met hers across the small distance that suddenly felt like a chasm. "Because when I found Catherine dying in that cabin, when I held those babies and promised her I'd see them safe for the first time in years, I had a reason to live instead of just surviving." "Pretty story," Morrison said coldly. "Doesn't change the fact that you're a wanted killer and those boys belong with family." "You want to know about family?" Bram's voice hardened. "Your brother Jack wasn't the saint you think he was. He was working with claim jumpers, running cons on prospectors who struck lucky. Catherine knew it, tried to get him to stop. That's why she was so far from civilization. When her time came, she was running from the life he'd dragged her into." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Bram reached slowly into his coat, his movements careful under the deputy's watchful eyes. He pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Catherine's diary. She wrote about Jack's business dealings, about the men he cheated, the violence he used when words weren't enough." He tossed the journal at Morrison's feet. "Your brother died in an avalanche, true enough, but he died running from men who wanted their gold back. I found his body, found Catherine barely alive, and I kept my promise to her. That's the truth of it." Morrison stared down at the journal as if it were a snake. "You could have written that, could have forged." "Read her handwriting," Bram challenged. "Compare it to letters she sent you before she headed west, unless you're willing to believe I can mimic a dead woman's script." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Eliza watched Morrison's face cycle through doubt, anger, and something that might have been recognition. Whatever he saw in that journal, it wasn't what he'd expected. Even if he made mistakes," Morrison said finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction, "those boys are still Morrison blood, still family." "Blood doesn't make family," Eliza said suddenly, surprising herself with her strength. "Love does, care does, showing up every day and choosing to be there, that's what makes family." She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Bram despite everything she'd learned. "These babies don't know you, Agent Morrison. They know us. They chose us. They're children. They don't get to choose. Then I'm choosing for them, she said firmly, as the woman who's raised them, fed them, loved them when they were sick and scared. I'm choosing the man who carried them through a blizzard over the stranger who wants to tear them away from everything they know. Morrison's face darkened. You have no legal standing here, Mrs. Dunn. No rights where these children are concerned. Maybe not, Eliza agreed. But I have something more important than legal standing. I have love, and I have the absolute certainty that what you're planning is wrong. She turned to look at Bram, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the saint she'd imagined, but not the monster Morrison painted either. A man who'd been broken by tragedy and had somehow found the strength to choose, protecting children over protecting himself. I don't care what you did before, she said quietly, her words meant for him alone. I care about who you are now, who you've been with those babies, with me. That's the man. She stopped, unable to finish the declaration with so many hostile ears listening. But Bram understood. His grey eyes softened with something approaching wonder. Eliza. Enough, Morrison snapped. Tally, you're under arrest for multiple murders. The children are coming with me. Deputies, bind him. The two lawmen stepped forward, but before they could reach Bram, another voice cut through the night. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone turned to see Silas standing in the cabin doorway, his rifle trained on Morrison. His face was grim but determined, and for the first time in their marriage, Eliza felt something approaching respect for her husband. This is my land, Silas announced. These are my guests, and you boys are trespassing. The rifle in Silas's hands seemed to transform everything about him. Gone was the bullying coward who beat women in private and cowered before real opposition. In his place stood a man defending his territory with the grim determination of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Silas, what are you doing? Morrison demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before stopping at the sight of the rifle's steady barrel pointed at his chest. I'm protecting what's mine, Silas replied, his voice carrying a weight Eliza had never heard before. This ranch, these people, they're under my protection. You want to take them? You'll have to go through me first. The deputies shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their guns, but unwilling to draw on an armed man who technically had the legal right to defend his property. The situation had become a powder keg, with too many lit fuses and no clear authority to defuse it. This is insane, Morrison sputtered. You're harboring a wanted killer, Dunn. The law says a man's home is his castle, Silas interrupted. Says I got the right to defend it against anyone who comes calling without proper warrants or legal process. You got papers that say you can search my property. Papers that give you jurisdiction over my household. Morrison's face flushed red in the torchlight. I've got a murder warrant. For crimes allegedly committed in the high country, outside my property. You got any evidence he committed crimes here, on my land, against my family? Silas's voice grew harder. Because if you don't, then you're just trespassers with badges, and I got every right to ask you to leave. Eliza stared at her husband in amazement. This was not the same man who'd spent 7 years making her life miserable. This was someone else entirely, someone with principles and the courage to act on them. She didn't understand the transformation, but she recognized its reality. Bram stepped closer to Silas, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook the nervous deputies. Why? He asked quietly. Why help me now? Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Morrison, but his attention clearly focused inward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. Because I've seen what you do for them babies, he said finally. Seen how gentle you are with them, how patient. Seen how my wife smiles when she holds them, how she sings again like she used to before. He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said more than he intended. Before what? Eliza asked softly. Silas's grip on the rifle tightened. Before I killed the good in her, before I turned into the kind of man who hits women and calls it strength. His voice cracked slightly. I know what I am, Eliza, known for years, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from being it. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, the standoff continued, Morrison and his men facing off against Silas and his rifle butt. The real drama was happening in the words that had needed saying for so long. "Those babies brought something back to life in this house," Silas continued. "Something I thought I'd destroyed forever. You think I'm going to let some badge-wearing stranger tear it down for the sake of his revenge?" "It's not revenge," Morrison protested. "It's justice." "Justice?" Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I beat my wife for 7 years and called it marriage. You planning to arrest me for that? Or is your justice only for crimes that don't involve proper white men disciplining their property?" The challenge was direct and uncomfortable. Morrison's face worked through several emotions before settling on cold anger. "That's different. That's what?" Bram asked quietly. "Legal, acceptable, the kind of crime that doesn't count because it happens behind closed doors." "Exactly," Silas said, his voice bitter with self-knowledge. "And if that don't make me worse than a man who killed dirty lawmen to save innocent lives, then I don't know what justice looks like anymore." From inside the cabin came the sound of babies crying, blue and brown, sensing the tension even through the walls, their small voices rising in distress. The sound seemed to cut through everyone present, a reminder of what was really at stake in this confrontation. "Listen to them," Eliza said, her voice carrying across the space between the armed men. "They're scared. They don't understand why there are angry voices and bright lights in the middle of the night. All they know is that the people who love them are in danger." She took a step toward Morrison, ignoring the deputy's nervous movements. "You say you want what's best for those boys. Look at what you're doing to them right now. Look at the fear you're creating in their lives." "They'll understand when they're older," Morrison said, but his conviction was wavering. "When they know the truth about their father, about the man you've been letting care for them." "The truth," Eliza's voice rose with righteous anger. "The truth is that Bram found 2 babies dying in a mountain cabin and chose to save them instead of leaving them to freeze. The truth is that he's fed them when they were hungry, comforted them when they cried, carried them through blizzards to keep them safe." She gestured toward the cabin where the crying continued. "The truth is that those boys call him Papa because that's what he's been to them. Not because of blood or law or family name, but because he earned that title every single day since he found them." "Pretty words," Pike Jennings spoke up from where he'd been standing silent in the shadows. "But they don't change what he is. I seen him kill men in cold blood. You seen him defend himself against claim jumpers and thieves." Bram interrupted, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Same as you've done yourself, Pike. Don't pretend the High Country's a place where men settle disputes with lawyers and judges." Jennings shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe so, but them deputies he killed were corrupt, were murderers themselves, were planning to frame me for their own crimes." Bram's grey eyes fixed on the trapper. "You know it too, or you wouldn't have waited this long to come forward. Took Morrison's money to tell his version of the story, didn't you?" The accusation hit home. Jennings flushed red, and his hand moved toward his gun, but Silas's rifle swung to cover him. "Easy there, Pike," Silas said mildly. "This is still my property, and I still make the rules here." The tableau held for a moment 6 armed men in a circle of torchlight, their weapons creating a deadly geometry that could explode into violence with the smallest provocation. In the middle of it all stood Eliza, unarmed but unafraid, her presence somehow the most powerful force in the confrontation. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising authority. "You're going to leave my property, all of you. You're going to let those babies sleep through the night without strange men with guns shouting outside their window." "Mrs. Dunn, you don't have the authority," one of the deputies started to say. "I have the authority of a mother protecting her children," she cut him off. "And if that's not enough for you, then what kind of men are you?" Morrison's face cycled through frustration, anger, and something that might have been doubt. He looked at his men, at Silas's unwavering rifle, at Bram's calm readiness for whatever came next. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No." Bram agreed quietly, but it's not going to be settled at gunpoint in front of babies either. You want to talk about justice? Let's do it proper. Court hearing, legal representation, evidence presented fair and square. You're wanted for murder. There's no court hearing. There is, if Silas presses charges against you for trespassing and threatening his family, Bram replied. Local jurisdiction trumps territorial warrants when it comes to immediate crimes. You'd know that if you were a real lawman instead of a grieving brother with a badge. The insult stung, but it also contained enough legal truth to give Morrison pause. In the complex web of territorial law, property rights and local authority could indeed complicate federal warrants, especially when the accused hadn't actually committed any crimes on local soil. 1 week, Morrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. 1 week to get your affairs in order, say your goodbyes, whatever you need to do. Then I'm coming back with proper papers and enough men to make your little stand here look like the joke it is. 1 week? Bram agreed. As Morrison and his men mounted their horses, Eliza felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. In 1 week, everything would come to a head, and there would be no more delays, no more legal technicalities to hide behind. She looked at the 3 men who had just risked everything to protect her and the baby's Silas with his surprising courage, Bram with his quiet strength, even Pike Jennings who had seemed to waver at the end. In different ways, each of them had been broken by the harsh realities of frontier life. But tonight, in the face of real danger, they'd found ways to be better than their circumstances. The riders disappeared into the darkness, their torches fading like falling stars. In their wake, silence settled over the ranch knot, the oppressive quiet of fear, but the deeper stillness of people gathering strength for what was to come. 1 week, 7 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone she'd come to love. 7 days to figure out how to keep a family together when the law itself seemed determined to tear them apart. As Silas lowered his rifle and Bram moved toward the cabin to comfort the crying babies, Eliza made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Whatever came next, she would not go back to being the frightened, passive woman she'd been. The twins had taught her how to love again. Bram had shown her what protection looked like. Silas had demonstrated that even broken men could choose to do right. Now it was her turn to choose, and she chose to fight. The week passed like water through cupped hand stew, fast and too slow at the same time. Each dawn brought them closer to Morrison's promised return, while each sunset marked another day of precious normalcy that might be their last. Bram spent the days teaching Eliza everything he could about survival, defense, and the harsh realities of life outside the law. Not because he expected her to become an outlaw, but because he needed her to understand the choices that might lie ahead. If things go bad, he said on the 6th morning as they worked together in the garden, if Morrison takes me and comes for the boys, you take them and head for the Hartwell place. Betty's a good woman. She'll help you get to town, find a lawyer, fight this proper through the courts. And if the courts don't help? Eliza asked, her hands steady on the weeding despite the tremor in her voice. Then you disappear, change your names, head east, where nobody knows your faces. Raise those boys like they deserve with love and patience and the knowledge that someone fought for them. Eliza pulled a stubborn weed from the soil with perhaps more force than necessary. You talk like you're already gone. I'm not gone, but I'm not fool enough to think good intentions can stop bullets. Bram's voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the pain underneath. Morrison's got the law on his side, and men with badges don't like being told no by mountain hermits and stubborn women. Stubborn women have been changing the world longer than men, with badges have been trying to stop them, she replied, surprising herself with her vehemence. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Sheriff Bradley arrived alone. His face was grim as he dismounted, and he carried an official-looking document in his weathered hands. Tom, Silas greeted him from the porch, his own rifle within easy reach. The events of the previous week had changed the dynamic between all the men, creating new alliances and understanding where none had existed before. Silas, Bram. Bradley nodded to each man before his eyes found Eliza. Mrs. Dunn, I wish I was here on happier business. But you're not, Bram said simply. No, I'm not. Bradley held up the document. Got official word from the territorial court. Morrison's pushed through an emergency custody order for the boys. Legal guardianship transfers to him effective immediately. Eliza felt the world tilt beneath her feet. On what grounds? On the grounds that they're in the care of a wanted fugitive and a woman with no legal standing. Bradley's voice carried genuine regret. I'm sorry, Eliza. I know what those babies mean to you, but the law's the law. The law. Silas spat the words like a curse. Same law that says a man can beat his wife without consequence. Same law that lets rich men buy justice while poor folks hang for stealing bread. It's not perfect, Bradley admitted, but it's all we got. Alternative is letting every man decide right and wrong for himself, and that way lies chaos. Maybe chaos would be better than this, Eliza said quietly, her arms tightening around Blue, who she'd been carrying while Brown napped inside. Maybe letting people decide right and wrong for themselves would produce more justice than your courts and your badges. Bradley looked at her with something approaching respect. You know what you're saying, Mrs. Dunn? You're talking about defying a lawful order. That's a serious crime. Defying an unjust order, she corrected. There's a difference. From inside the cabin came the sound of horses, approaching many horses, moving fast. Through the window, Eliza could see dust rising from the direction of town. Morrison was coming, and he'd brought more men than before. Tom, Bram said urgently, you need to leave. Now. What's about to happen? You don't want to be part of it. Bradley hesitated, torn between duty and conscience. Bram, don't do anything foolish. Think about those babies. I am thinking about them. Bram cut him off. That's all I've been thinking about. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Morrison's voice carried across the distance, shouting orders to his men. They were surrounding the ranch, cutting off escape routes, preparing for a siege. Last chance, Tom, Silas said, checking his rifle with practiced movements. Either you're with us or against us, but you can't be both. Bradley looked at the custody order in his hands, then at the babies Eliza held so protectively, then at the three adults who were clearly prepared to fight the entire territorial government to protect what they'd built together. Damn, he muttered, folding the document and tucking it into his coat. My Sarah always said I was too stubborn for my own good. What's that mean? Eliza asked. Bradley smiled grimly and drew his pistol, checking the cylinder before holstering it again. Means I must have missed that custody order somewhere on the trail. Terrible thing, losing important documents. Happens more often than you'd think. The first shots rang out before anyone could respond to Bradley's declaration. Morrison's men had reached the ranch, and they weren't interested in negotiation this time. Glass exploded from the cabin windows as bullets found their mark, and the twins began screaming in terror. Get inside, Bram shouted, pushing Eliza toward the door. Keep the babies low and away from the windows. Silas was already moving, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy, as Morrison's men sought cover behind the barn and outbuildings. Bradley cursed and dove for protection behind the water trough, his own weapon adding to the defensive fire. This was the moment when everything they'd built together would either survive or be destroyed by men who confused law with justice, authority with righteousness. As bullets whined overhead and the babies cried in her arms, Eliza made one last choice, not between right and wrong that had been decided long ago, but between surrender and resistance, between accepting the world as it was and fighting for the world as it should be. She chose to fight. Inside the cabin, Eliza moved with purpose, born of desperation and love. She gathered the screaming twins close to her chest, their small bodies trembling with terror at the sudden violence that had shattered their peaceful world. The quilt Bram had given them, soft blue wool that had once belonged to his lost wife Sarah, became their shield as she crouched in the corner farthest from the windows. "Shh, my darlings," she whispered against their hair, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Mama's here. Papa's here. We're going to keep you safe." Blue clung to her with tiny fists, while Brown pressed his face against her shoulder, both boys seeking comfort in her familiar scent and gentle touch. They didn't understand the danger, but they understood her calm presence, and gradually their cries softened to frightened whimpers. Outside, the battle raged with deadly intensity. Silas had positioned himself behind the thick logs of the porch, his rifle cracking with methodical precision. Years of hunting had made him an excellent shot, and Morrison's men were learning that lesson the hard way. "Tally!" Morrison's voice boomed across the ranch yard. "Send out the children and surrender yourself. No one else has to die today." "Go to hell, Morrison!" Bram's reply came from near the barn, where he'd taken cover to protect their flank. "Those boys stay with their family." A hail of bullets answered him, splintering wood and raising dust clouds where they struck. But Morrison's men were city deputies, more accustomed to serving warrants than engaging in firefights. Their shooting was wild, panicked, while the defenders fought with the calculated desperation of people protecting everything they held dear. Sheriff Bradley had found a position behind the water trough that gave him a clear view of the approaching riders. His years of experience showed as he picked his shots carefully, each bullet finding its mark or forcing an attacker to seek better cover. "How many?" Silas called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "8, maybe 9, Bradley called back. "Morrison brought half the territorial marshal's office." "Then we better make our shots count." Bram's voice carried grim determination. The next wave of attackers came from 2 directions at once, 3 men charging the front of the cabin, while others tried to circle around toward the back. It was a coordinated assault designed to divide the defenders' attention and overwhelm their position. Eliza heard boots on the cabin's back porch and realized with cold clarity that the battle had come to her. She gently placed the twins in the corner, the blue quilt wrapped around them like armor, and reached for the kitchen knife Bram had taught her to hold properly. The back door exploded inward as a deputy kicked it off its hinges. He stepped into the dim interior with his gun raised, clearly expecting to find a cowering woman and helpless children. Instead, he found Eliza May Dunn transformed, no longer the broken victim who had endured years of abuse in silence, but a mother protecting her young with the fierce determination of a she-wolf defending her den. "Stay back," she warned, the knife steady in her grip. "Don't come any closer." The deputy sneered at her defiance. "Put down that kitchen knife, lady. You're interfering with official." He never finished the sentence. Eliza moved with surprising speed, the lessons Bram had taught her, combining with her own desperate courage. The knife found the deputy's gun arm, and his weapon clattered to the floor as he howled in pain and surprise. "I said, stay back," she repeated, positioning herself between the wounded man and the corner where the twins huddled. Outside, the sound of gunfire was intensifying. Silas roared in pain as a bullet found his shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. His rifle never stopped speaking, each shot deliberate and deadly. Bram appeared in the shattered doorway like an avenging angel, his own rifle smoking. He took in the scene, the wounded deputy clutching his arm, Eliza standing over him with bloody knife in hand, the twins crying but unharmed in their quilted nest. "You did good," he told her simply, then turned his attention to the deputy. "You move from that spot, you die. Understand?" The man nodded frantically, pressing his back against the wall and making no attempt to retrieve his fallen weapon. From outside came Morrison's voice, shrill with rage and desperation. "Burn them out. If we can't take them alive, we'll take them dead." The smell of smoke began to drift through the broken windows. Morrison's men were setting fire to the barn, the chicken coop, anything that would burn and spread toward the cabin. "We have to move," Bram said urgently. "Can't defend a burning building." Eliza scooped up the twins, their small faces tear-streaked, but trusting as she held them close. "Where?" "The root cellar. Stone walls, separate entrance. It'll protect you from the fire and the bullets." "What about you?" Bram's grey eyes met hers, and she saw the terrible knowledge there, Someone had to hold the line long enough for her and the babies to reach safety. Someone had to make the ultimate sacrifice. "I'll be right behind you," he lied with gentle conviction. As flames began to lick at the cabin's walls and Morrison's men closed in for their final assault, Eliza understood that this was the moment when everything would be decided. Not by laws or courts or badges, but by the simple question of how much people were willing to sacrifice for love. The answer, she realized as she ran toward the cellar with the twins clutched against her heart, was everything. The root cellar smelled of earth and potatoes, a clean, honest scent that seemed impossibly peaceful after the violence above. Eliza crouched in the darkness with the twins pressed against her, listening to the muffled sounds of gunfire and shouting that filtered down through the stone walls. Blue had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by fear and confusion, while Brown stayed awake but quiet, his dark eyes reflecting the thin shaft of light that came through the cellar's ventilation grate. Minutes passed like hours. The shooting seemed to be moving farther away from the cabin, toward the burning barn, where the final confrontation was taking place. She heard Bram's voice calling out challenges to Morrison, heard Silas cursing as he reloaded his rifle, heard Sheriff Bradley shouting orders that nobody seemed inclined to follow. Then suddenly, silence. The quiet was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. In battles, noise meant lifemen fighting, struggling, refusing to give up. Silence meant someone had won, someone had lost, and she had no way of knowing which was which. She waited, counting her heartbeats in the darkness, until she heard footsteps on the wooden stairs leading down to the cellar. Heavy boots, moving with purpose but not urgency. Her hand tightened on the kitchen knife she still carried, prepared for one last fight if Morrison's men had found her hiding place. The cellar door creaked open, and Bram's voice called softly, "Eliza, it's safe now. You can come up." She almost sobbed with relief. "Bram, is it really over?" "It's over." His weathered face appeared in the doorway, streaked with soot and blood, but wearing an expression of profound peace. "Morrison's dead. His men are scattered or surrendered. It's over." She climbed the stairs carefully, the twins stirring at the movement but not waking. Outside, the barn was still burning, but the cabin had been saved, its walls blackened but intact. Silas sat on the porch steps, while Sheriff Bradley bandaged his wounded shoulder, both men looking exhausted but victorious. "How?" she asked simply. "Pike Jennings," Bram replied, gesturing toward where the wild trapper stood, talking quietly with Bradley. "Turns out his conscience got the better of his greed." When Morrison ordered the burning, Pike realized what kind of man he'd been helping. Shot Morrison himself, then called off the other deputies. Eliza looked at Jennings with new understanding. The wilderness had a way of stripping men down to their essential selves, and apparently his essential self was better than his desperate circumstances had suggested. "What happens now?" she asked. Sheriff Bradley looked up from Silas's bandages. "Now we write up a report that says Morrison went mad with grief and attacked innocent civilians. Says his men surrendered when they realized they were following illegal orders. Says the Territorial Marshal's office owes you folks an apology. And the warrant? The charges against Bram?" Bradley smiled grimly. "Funny thing about paperwork, sometimes it gets lost. Sometimes witnesses change their stories when they learn the full truth. Sometimes justice has to be more than just following rules written by men who weren't there." Over the following days, as they cleaned up the damage and rebuilt what had been destroyed, the truth of their new reality began to settle into place. Morrison was dead, his vendetta buried with him. The territorial authorities, embarrassed by the debacle, were happy to let the matter disappear quietly. Pike Jennings had vanished back into the mountains, carrying his conscience and his share of guilt to whatever peace he could find there. Most importantly, the twins were safe. Blue began walking during the recovery week, taking his first wobbling steps from Eliza's arms to Bram's waiting hands. Brown followed 2 days later, more cautious but equally determined. Watching them toddle around the rebuilt cabin, babbling to each other in their private twin language, Eliza felt her heart healing from wounds she'd carried for years. Silas's transformation proved to be permanent. The violence had burned something out of him, not his strength, but his cruelty. He began treating Eliza with the respect and gentleness she'd always deserved, and while their marriage would never be loving, it became something she could live with dignity. But it was Bram who brought the most significant change to her life. 3 months after the battle, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, he asked her to walk with him to the small cemetery behind the cabin where her 3 daughters lay buried. "I've been thinking," he said as they stood among the weathered wooden crosses, "about family, about what makes people belong to each other." "Have you?" she replied, though her heart was racing with anticipation of what he might say next. "Those boys in there, they're not mine by blood, but they're mine in every way that matters. Same as you're not mine by law or custom, but you're mine in every way that counts." He pulled a small object from his Pokita simple gold ring, worn smooth by years of handling. This was Sarah's. She'd wanted to go to someone who understands what it means to love children that didn't come from your body, to build family from choice instead of chance. Eliza looked at the ring, then at the man offering it, then at the small graves that represented her past grief and the distant sound of children laughing that represented her future joy. "Bram Tally," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life, making sure you never doubt that you're loved, that those boys never question that they're wanted, that this family we've built stays strong no matter what tries to tear it apart." She took the ring from his calloused palm and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her. 1 year later, Eliza May Tally sat on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching her husband teach Blue and Brown how to whittle wooden animals from scraps of pine. Her own hand rested on her swelling belly, where their first child together grew strong and safe. On the small table beside her chair lay a simple sketch. She'd drawn a family portrait showing all of them together, smiling. She'd kept that promise to herself, the one she'd made in the darkness of the root cellar. She'd fought for love, and love had won. Not easily, not without cost, but completely and forever. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, full of promise and possibility. And for the first time in her adult life, Eliza wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring.